After Caesar fell, Brutus did not immediately look like a villain. He looked like a man who believed he had saved Rome. But 2,000 years later, most people do not remember his reasons. They remember one word: betrayal. That is the curse of Brutus. A complicated republican trapped inside a play, a murder scene, and one famous line. We think we know this story. Caesar was the great conqueror, Brutus was his trusted friend, and then the Senate became a betrayal scene. That version is simple, clean, and easy to remember. It gives us a hero, a traitor, and a death scene that ends every moral question. But real Rome was never that simple. Caesar was not just a friend, Brutus was not just an assassin, and the Republic was not healthy. When Brutus raised the knife, he was not only attacking a man, he was attacking a power structure he believed was killing Roman liberty. The question is whether he was defending the Republic or simply releasing a chaos more dangerous than Caesar himself. What makes Brutus fascinating is not that he was innocent, it is that his crime came from something that sounded noble. He did not kill for gold or a throne, or because Caesar stole his lover. He said he killed for liberty. And one of history's most dangerous moments comes when a person believes violence has become the only way to save freedom. To understand Brutus, we cannot begin with the assassination. We have to begin with the word Romans feared most: king. For Romans, king was not a neutral word. It meant oppression, arrogance, and a past they swore would never return. Roman republican culture was built around that fear. Power had to be divided, offices limited, and no man placed above the law. Of course, reality was never that pure. Noble families chased glory, elections were poisoned by money, and armies increasingly followed generals instead of the state. But the Republic still imagined itself as a system of liberty. Its aristocrats believed they were citizens managing the world, not subjects bowing to a master. Brutus was born inside that imagination. His name itself was a political burden, a family legend, and a set of expectations. According to Roman tradition, an earlier Lucius Junius Brutus had helped overthrow Rome's last king and establish the Republic. That story was not just family pride. For later Romans, the name Brutus almost became a symbol of resistance to kingship. So Marcus Junius Brutus grew up as more than another nobleman. He inherited a myth about liberty, sacrifice, and killing tyrants. That does not mean he was destined from childhood to stab Caesar. History does not work that neatly, but his world was filled with symbols. In Rome, ancestry, reputation, and public image mattered deeply. Who you were often depended on what your ancestors demanded you become. Brutus was highly educated and influenced by Greek philosophy, especially ideas of duty, restraint, and public virtue associated with Stoic thought. He liked to see himself as a principled man, even when his real behavior did not always match that image. The self-image mattered. This is the first crack in the Brutus story. He wanted to be a moral Roman inside a political system becoming increasingly immoral. By the time Brutus reached adulthood, the Republic had already been torn by decades of violence, civil war, and ambition. The struggles of Marius and Sulla had proved Roman armies could enter Rome, political enemies could be legally slaughtered, and law could serve the winner. The Senate still existed, elections still happened, and speeches still praised ancient liberty, but everyone knew swords had entered politics. Caesar did not begin this crisis. He was one of its brightest, most successful, and most dangerous results. Young Caesar was not yet the demigod of later statues. He was a debt-heavy, wildly ambitious nobleman who understood popular politics as performance. He knew how to charm crowds, challenge conservatives, and present himself as the people's friend blocked by arrogant senators. To many ordinary Romans, that image was attractive. To many senators, the same image was terrifying. Brutus was not originally a Caesarian. His political ties, family memory, and aristocratic identity pulled him toward the Republican side. But things became complicated because Roman politics was never just ideology. It was debt, marriage, family resentment, and personal favors too. Brutus's mother, Servilia, had a close relationship with Caesar, which later fed rumors that Brutus might even have been Caesar's son. There is no solid evidence for that claim, and the chronology is difficult, but it survived because it made the betrayal story more dramatic. If Brutus was only a political enemy, the story was already powerful. If he was almost a son killing a father, it became tragic myth. Later memory loves myths like that. They are sharper than reality and much easier to compress into a single line. The real situation was less melodramatic and more political. Caesar did show Brutus mercy, and at a critical moment, he spared him. During the civil war between Caesar and Pompey, Brutus sided with Pompey. That was not surprising. Many Republican nobles did the same. Pompey was not simply a saint of the Republic. He had been a super general himself, with enormous military power and a history of bending politics. But when Caesar crossed the Rubicon and brought troops into Italy, many senators saw Pompey as the last force capable of stopping Caesar's dominance. Brutus choosing Pompey was not only personal, it was a Roman aristocrat choosing the remains of a system over the brilliance of one man. Then Pompey lost. Caesar won. By earlier Roman Civil War standards, defeated enemies could expect exile, confiscation, or death. But Caesar did something smarter. He pardoned many opponents, including Brutus, and brought them back into public life. That mercy looked generous, and it may have contained real magnanimity, but it was also a display of power. When one man can decide who is forgiven, who returns, and who keeps a public identity, he already stands above the Republic. Brutus accepted Caesar's pardon. That later made his reputation heavier, because the killing no longer looked purely political. To many eyes, he killed the man who had saved his political life. That is where the label of ingratitude began to bite. But from Brutus's point of view, perhaps the issue was not personal gratitude. Perhaps Caesar's mercy itself proved Caesar had power no citizen should possess. That is the moral trap Brutus could not easily escape. If he thanked Caesar, he accepted a personal patron above the Republic. If he resisted Caesar, he could be called a betrayer of his benefactor. Either way, he could not remain clean. After Caesar's victory, Rome seemed to regain order on the surface, but that order increasingly looked like the order of one man. He held dictatorship, controlled elections, assigned offices, reformed the calendar, rewarded soldiers, pardoned enemies, and concentrated decision-making around himself. Many reforms were not absurd. In fact, some answered problems the Republic had delayed for generations. That is why Caesar is hard to judge. He was not only a destructive tyrant, he could solve problems the old system could not solve. For ordinary people, a strong man who offered land, grain, debt relief, and order could look better than aristocratic paralysis. For senatorial nobles, the same strong man looked like the end of the Republic. He let them exist while hollowing out their meaning. Brutus stood in the middle of that fracture. He was not a champion of the poor, and not a democrat in the modern sense. The liberty he spoke of was mostly Roman aristocratic liberty, not being dominated by one man, not bending to a master. That liberty was imperfect and excluded most ordinary people, women, slaves, and conquered peoples. But in the elite Roman world, it was a real political language. So when Brutus spoke of liberty, we should not imagine a modern liberal, but we should not dismiss him as a simple fraud either. He belonged to an unequal world, yet sincerely believed that a certain republican virtue was being destroyed. Then Caesar accepted more unsettling honors. Statues, titles, ceremonies, and privileges began piling up around him at an unprecedented pace. Some honors may have been pushed by supporters, some may have been political tests, and some may have been exaggerated by enemies. But in a city that hated the title king, any symbol close to monarchy became explosive. Rumor, ritual, and public performance began to matter more than legal wording. People asked not whether Caesar was king, but whether he wanted to be. For a man like Brutus, that question may already have been deadly enough. The death of a republic does not always need an official announcement. Sometimes a republic dies while everyone is still using the old words, but real power has already moved into one pair of hands. The conspiracy did not appear in a single night. It grew from anxiety, shame, aristocratic rivalry, and an increasingly intense sense of historical role. The conspirators had different motives. Some feared tyranny sincerely, some envied Caesar, some lost influence, and some wanted their old status restored. Calling them all freedom fighters is too naive. Calling them all selfish nobles is too simple. Brutus mattered because he gave the conspiracy moral weight. Without him, the assassination looked more like the resentment of men who had lost. With Brutus, the killing could be framed as the return of republican tradition, almost a replay of the ancestor who resisted kings. Ancient accounts say Brutus faced pressure, including anonymous messages suggesting he had failed to live up to his name. Those details cannot all be verified with confidence, but they reflect a real pressure. The name Brutus itself seemed to call him toward action. Imagine living under the legend of an ancestor while the man before you is increasingly suspected of wanting to be king. If you stay silent, you are a coward. If you act, you become a murderer. That is the shape of tragedy. Brutus did not think assassination was harmless. His problem was that he began to think inaction was worse. On the Ides of March, 44 BC, Caesar came to the Senate meeting place. The conspirators were ready, and Roman history was about to be cut open. When we imagine the scene today, we often see a clear stage. Caesar robes, blades, a falling body, and Brutus. But the ancient sources do not agree on every detail. We have to be careful not to treat later drama as a transcript. The most famous line, AT2, Brute, comes mainly from Shakespeare's play, not from a reliable record of Caesar's final words. The line is almost too perfect. It turns politics into personal betrayal and a republican crisis into one wounded friend's final look. Because it is so perfect, it devoured the messier reality. People stopped asking why Brutus acted and asked only how he could. Caesar was stabbed many times. However complicated Brutus's motives were, the scene itself was a collective murder. That fact must remain clear. Brutus was not merely a thinker. He took part in killing and believed killing could solve a political crisis. But after Caesar fell, things did not return to the Republic as the conspirators seemed to expect. They appear to have believed that once the tyrant was dead, liberty would naturally come back. It was a noble-sounding but dangerously thin idea. Institutions do not revive automatically because one man dies. Fear, armies, debt, factions, and public emotion do not vanish with bloodstains. Brutus and the conspirators did not immediately control the city, did not control the story, and did not control Caesar's veterans or supporters. They walked into the streets calling for liberty and discovered many Romans did not cheer the way they expected. To senatorial nobles, Caesar might have looked like a dictator. To some citizens and soldiers, he was patron, reformer, and symbol of victory. This is where Brutus misread Rome. He assumed republican liberty was still the highest shared language of the city. But Rome had changed. Many people disliked the word tyrant, yet did not long for the old world of senatorial control. Mark Antony soon understood the opening. Unlike the conspirators, he did not only speak in principles, he understood emotion, funerals, and crowd politics. Caesar's body, will, wounds, and memory became political weapons. The dead man did not speak, but his body said plenty. Antony's funeral speech became the turning point in traditional memory. Whatever the exact words were, the result was clear. Public feeling turned against the killers. Brutus wanted to become a liberator, but he increasingly looked like a regicide, an ingrate, and a maker of chaos. Worse still, Caesar's death did not destroy personal power. It opened the door to new contests for personal power. The young Octavian appeared. As Caesar's adopted son and heir, he may first have looked like another name on the political board. But Octavian would prove calmer and more patient than Brutus, Antony, and many of Caesar's enemies. Brutus killed Caesar to stop one man from ruling Rome. In the end, he helped clear the road toward the rule of Augustus. That does not mean Brutus alone created the empire. The Republic's collapse had started long before, and Caesar was part of a much larger process. But Brutus accelerated the ending. He turned a constitutional crisis into a war of revenge, inheritance, and legitimacy. The assassins fled Rome and regrouped. They still used the language of the Republic, but now they needed armies, money, and the resources of eastern provinces. Here another cruel contradiction appeared. To save a republic against military domination, Brutus had to behave like a warlord. He raised taxes, gathered troops, made alliances, and pressured those who resisted. He had to defend a political ideal through the tools that had already distorted it. That makes his image more complicated. He could speak philosophically about virtue while making harsh choices inside political reality. This does not mean he was completely hypocritical. More accurately, he embodied the contradiction of the late Republic's elite. They wanted liberty, but could only protect it with power. Eventually, Brutus and Cassius faced Antony and Octavian at Philippi. The future of the Republic was compressed onto a battlefield. Philippi was not a simple battle of good against evil. It was another chapter of Roman civil war, a bloody collision between competing claims of legitimacy. Brutus's side lost. Cassius died first, and Brutus later chose suicide rather than capture by his enemies. His death carried a kind of old Roman aristocratic dignity, but also the shadow of complete failure. He killed Caesar and still did not save the Republic. That is why Brutus is more tragic than an ordinary traitor. His action changed history, but it did not achieve his purpose. Seen harshly, he was a political assassin who committed murder, misread the public, and helped unleash more civil war. Seen sympathetically, he was a man trapped by old Republican ideals, trying to prevent power from becoming permanently concentrated. Both versions hold part of the truth. The problem is that later memory often keeps only one. Shakespeare made Brutus one of the English-speaking world's most memorable betrayers, but also one of its most conflicted assassins. The Brutus of the play is not a sneaking villain. He is a man who wrongly believes politics can be repaired with a knife. Popular memory became even simpler than Shakespeare. It took one line and compressed the whole man into Caesar's betraying friend. That is the power of a historical label. It does not need to be entirely false. It only needs to be strong enough to make complexity inconvenient. Brutus did betray Caesar's trust. From the perspective of personal mercy and political pardon, that charge cannot simply be erased. But if we only say he betrayed Caesar, we miss the other claim. Brutus believed Caesar had already betrayed the Republic. That does not automatically make Brutus right. A man believing he has a just cause does not make his blade just, but it makes the story more disturbing. The most frightening political violence is often not committed by people who think they are evil. It is often committed by people who believe they are preventing a greater disaster. So Brutus was not just the man who betrayed Caesar. He was a man pushed toward the blade by name, tradition, fear, principle, and misjudgment. He saw the danger in Caesar, but failed to see the greater danger that could emerge after Caesar's death. He wanted to kill a tyrant and helped create a system of emperors more durable than Caesar himself. That is the real historical reversal of Brutus. He was not a simple villain and not a pure hero of liberty. He was a recurring human type in history, the person who believes he is saving a system while destroying its last supports. Maybe that is why his story still lives. It is not only asking whether betraying a friend is evil. It asks a harder question. When a republic is already rotting, does anyone have the right to save it through violence? Brutus answered yes. He answered with a knife, and then proved through failure that the answer was never that simple. 2,000 years later, we still see him beside Caesar, blood on his hand, reasons in his heart, and Rome collapsing behind him. If we only call him a traitor, we lose the most important warning inside the story. Liberty can be destroyed by tyrants, but also by those who believe they are saving liberty. Brutus has been trapped for 2,000 years inside one famous line, but perhaps Caesar's final look was not the real prison. The real prison was that Brutus could never prove the knife had saved the Republic.